Chapter 33. Down the Outhouse Hole. Eddie was awarded a full scholarship and arrived at Exeter with a suitcase full of old button-down shirts he'd gotten at Goodwill, a few ties, and a couple of slightly worn sports coats. He struggled with tying his tie, but he noticed that none of the other boys bothered with perfection either. They were mostly sons of politicians, investment bankers, and very successful businessmen. One of his classmates was the Crown Prince of Thailand. Eddie was given a room on the third floor of one of the old brick dormitories. His roommate, David Abel, was a Jewish boy from New York City. He talked about his trips to Europe and Christmas vacations in Colorado. David's uncle came to visit one weekend and took David and Eddie out to a fancy restaurant. Eddie had heard of lobster, but had never seen one, much less eaten one. He relished every bite after carefully dipping it in melted butter. But about 2:30 that night, Eddie was bent over the toilet. The lobster had been too rich for him. In fact, there was a lot about Exeter that was too rich for him, but he tried to make the best of it. As he sat in a neighbor's room, admiring the Persian carpet and listening to a description of what the boys' stereo was capable of, Eddie felt like he'd landed on another planet. And it wasn't just the things the boys talked about. It was the way they talked. Pack ya kai and have it yad. Everything felt alien. Eddie missed his family so much. He realized he'd taken them for granted. He agonizingly marked the days and left until Christmas vacation, when the school would fly him home. The Chuck Yeager Memorial Airport at Charleston, West Virginia, looks like something a daredevil test pilot might try to land on. Because there's very little flat land in West Virginia, the decision was made to chop the top off two mountains and dump them in the intervening valley. Eddie's knuckles turned white as he gripped the armrest during the descent. He reminded himself of the old pilot's adage, "Any landing you can walk away from is a good landing." He just hoped he'd be able to walk away from this one. When he came through the gate, Eddie saw his family waiting for him. His mom hugged him, and his dad took his suitcase. His brothers looked at him with wonder and admiration. They stuffed his bag in the old VW microbus and packed themselves in around him. Then the questions began to fly. "Hey, Eddie, what's that place like?" "Yeah, what all do you all eat up there?" "Did you meet any millionaires?" The joy of being reunited with his family began to be replaced with astonishment. As he listened to his brothers talk, he came to the realization that they were hicks. All his life he'd grown up with these guys and never realized what a bunch of hillbillies they were. He was mortified. Of course, his brothers weren't the ones who had changed. Eddie had. He'd gone off to a highfalutin boarding school, and he'd come home uppity. God has his ways of dealing with pride, and Eddie stood in need of the treatment. When he finally climbed the hill to the old farmhouse, he also stood in need of a bathroom. But there was no bathroom. It was back to the old outhouse on that cool December afternoon. He dropped his suitcase at the back door and headed across the yard with some misgivings. The wooden door creaked open. He was greeted by powerful yet familiar smells. Stepping inside, he turned around and unbuckled his belt. Just as he was dropping his pants, he heard a faint sound coming from deep down in the hole. It was a small, splashing noise that triggered an alarm in Eddie's mind. He reached around to check on his wallet, but it was gone. Turning around, he leaned over the hole, being very careful not to breathe. He squinted into the darkness, and as his eyes adjusted, they grew wide in horror. There, at the bottom of the hole, sat his soggy billfold. It was at this point that Eddie's Ivy League education started to kick in. He refused to panic. Instead, he began to formulate a plan, listing his assets and liabilities. At the top of the asset list were his 5 younger brothers. At the top of that list was his brother, Jimmy. Without any further ado, Eddie jogged back to the house and found his unsuspecting little brother. "Jimmy," he said in a serious way, "I'm in trouble, and I think you're the only one who can help me." "What's wrong?" asked Jimmy innocently. "Well, I've got a problem, and I'm going to need someone brave to help me solve it. Well, I'd ask one of the others, but they just don't have the courage it takes." "You're right," Jimmy admitted. "I am pretty brave. What do you need?" With that, Eddie explained his predicament, and Jimmy agreed to help. But he would need to gather some equipment first. He ran upstairs and brought down a mask and snorkel. He went to the kitchen and grabbed a pair of yellow rubber gloves and some salad tongs. He stepped out to the shed and returned with a roll of tape and a length of garden hose. He taped the hose to his snorkel, slipped on the mask, inserted his hands into the rubber gloves, and picked up the tongs. "Oh, hurry!" Jimmy said through the snorkel. Eddie took that to mean, "Okay, I'm ready." He followed Jimmy to the outhouse, carrying the extra hose. Jimmy hesitated when he looked down. It was mighty dark, mighty deep, and mighty gross. But he was the bravest one in the family, after all, and he'd given his word. He leaned over with the salad tongs and extended his arm, but he wasn't even close. He bent over from the waist, squirmed his shoulders through the hole, and stretched his arm as far as it would go. No luck. He still lacked about 6 inches. He came back up out of the hole. "You're going to have to hold me!" Eddie understood that he was going to have to hold Jimmy. So, back down he went, and Eddie got a good grip around his legs. Jimmy's feet lifted off the floor as Eddie lowered him head first down the hole. An evil idea came into Eddie's mind at that moment, an idea he regretted for the rest of his life. Even more, he regretted giving in to the temptation. Just at that moment, when little Jimmy was risking his life for his big brother, Eddie pretended he was letting go of Jimmy's legs. It was just the slightest little "hoorah!" But it was cold-blooded and evil, just the sort of thing one might expect from a big brother. In spite of the adrenaline rush, Jimmy managed to grab the wallet with his tongs, and Eddie, weak with laughter, pulled him up out of the hole. Jimmy spun around and furiously flung the billfold on the ground. He tore off the mask and snorkel and stared angrily into Eddie's bemused face. There were no words adequate for that moment, so after a couple of intense seconds, he stomped away in disgust, muttering vague threats. Eddie, on the other hand, was happy. He'd gotten his wallet back. He was home for the holidays, and Jimmy would probably forget the whole thing after a day or two. But that was where he was mistaken. It was precisely after a day or two that nature called again, and Eddie found himself on a warmish afternoon enjoying an old National Geographic in the outhouse. As he flipped the pages, He was blissfully ignorant of the vengeance being planned by his little brother. Again, Jimmy needed to gather some equipment. He checked through the kitchen cabinets until he found a half-full can of Red Devil lighter fluid. Then he rummaged through the drawers. His hand fell on a trusty box of Ohio blue-tip matches, the kind you can strike anywhere. Armed and dangerous, he slipped out the back door of the house. He crept up the hill, by the old graveyard, and looked down on the peaceful outhouse. He snuck down to the old apple tree with the rope swing hanging from it and listened. He could hear Eddie humming a tune, and he imagined him flipping through the pages of an article on Spain, sun-drenched splendor. Without making a sound, Jimmy slipped up behind the outhouse where a loose board hung sideways. He popped the lid on the lighter fluid, and aiming carefully, he began to squirt a stream through the crack. It began to puddle up around the left side of the seat. When there was a good-sized pool, Jimmy directed the stream to the right. Then, when all was ready, he squirted the stream back and forth to make a connecting channel between the two puddles. He set the can down beside him and produced the box of matches. The match flared softly as he struck it, and without waiting, Jimmy flicked it through the gap in the boards. Ka-whoom! Brilliant flames leapt 6 feet in the air around Eddie's ears. He screamed like a little girl and flung the magazine to the floor. He was convinced that this must be one of those fatal methane gas explosions you hear about in outhouses. He had to get out, fast. Leaping to his feet, he headed out the door, but he'd forgotten something. His breeches were wrapped around his ankles. Helplessly, he felt himself falling, and wham! He landed face first in the mud. But he didn't have time to lick his wounds. There was an exploding outhouse behind him. Struggling to pull his pants up over his bare behind, he waddled toward the house, unaware of the barely stifled laughter coming from behind the old apple tree. Eddie learned a lesson that day, every bit as good as his Ivy League education. In the words of the apostle, "Humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, so that at the proper time he may exalt you."